NabWave Radio, Nationalist radio from New Australian Bulletin. This is NabWave Radio with Nathan Sykes. Check out New Australian Bulletin on www.newaustralianbulletin.com. Now, I have with me Dr. Jim Saleam, and we're going to try to make a regular podcast. We're going to try to do it once a month. But now you had an interesting day today, didn't you, Jim?
Yes, and I was liaising with Mr. Simeon Boykov, who heads the Cossack Association in Australia, and he wanted to test the limits of freedom of speech in the so-called lockdown situations prevailing in Sydney. So what he did was he let it be known that there was going to be a walk conducted from the Rod Point Park in inner western Sydney. It will observe, he said, so-called social distancing rules, and people would carry Australian flags and Eureka flags and signage that would indicate that they were upset with the denial of civil rights, civil liberties. And a number of his friends and whatnot did attempt to get to this meeting, but it was cordoned off by police. Now, I turned up on the basis that I was going to write, and I will write an article about this event, and there were 4 riot squad vans, 4 police cars and 22 police at the start of this event. They turned away a number of people seeking access from the park. They questioned the bona fides of people, whether they lived within 10 kilometres of the park, turning those people away. And there was a long recorded discussion between Simeon Boykov and the police, and I believe that he is going to publish that. Essentially, after a very long debate with the police, it was ultimately agreed by them that there was nothing unlawful in a group of people observing their so-called social distancing rules, who conducted what was in effect a demonstration, albeit in the guise of exercise. This was established today, and it is, if you like, a legal reality today, unlike the so-called protests that took place in Sydney last weekend, which involved thousands and thousands of people, in which the police say it was an unlawful assembly and various incidents happened and so forth. So what Mr. Boykov did today with a handful of people and the determination to actually stand up for civil liberties, he actually established a pattern whereby people could, if they wanted to, organise what are in effect protests against lockdown politics in every suburb they want to do it, and there's very little the forces of public order can really do about it. That's what he achieved today.
He also managed to pull out the riot squad and 600 police cars. Didn't he tell us about that?
Well, it was quite remarkable because I actually arrived with my notebook and everything well prior to the first of anyone arriving. The police started sweeping the car park next to the Rod Point Park 3/4 of an hour ahead of time. By the time Mr. Boykov arrived in a large Land Rover type vehicle with a Australian national flag on the top, there were already a couple of police cars taking up position, and not just the 22 police who were there throughout the time. I made notes of some of the names of the officers just for the sake of the argument, the vehicle numbers that appeared. But later, after Mr. Boykov's protest had ended and he'd done an interview with a young journalist from the ABC, which I will refer to again in a moment, another 5 or 6 police descended upon the car park, and I was interviewed, and I was asked whether or not I was within the 10-kilometre rule, and why I was there, and if I was writing and reporting, how come I was just sitting down speaking with a person who was a member of Australia First who had arrived, and what that person's business was and where that person lived, and so on. So looking at the amount of resources and time that was expended on this, police resources are finite, something I'll also refer to in a moment. It was a ridiculous exercise. whoever ordered this, if I could just say this, that what should have occurred is 2 police should have turned up. Mr. Boykov's event should have just been viewed. He could have had his protest with his friends who fronted. If there was an incident or something, well, they called assistance. That's not what occurred. So the fact that so much time and energy is being devoted to these sorts of protests, I did say to the ABC journalist that it was my intention, and I will do this, to apply under the Government Information and Privacy Act for certain police papers. It's my belief that there are documents in existence that speak about the coronavirus emergency and speak about the methods employed, such as suburban lockdowns, internal passes, pulling over of people, giving of health orders to return home or go to a venue, control over where people work and when they work. This actually would be beyond the situation in a terrorism zone. And I would say to you that the Counter-Terrorism Command in this state and in every state has looked at what's actually occurred in these emergencies and is imposing that model upon the faked up counter-terror models. So they've actually now got a blueprint, if you like, for the suppression of any form of civil protest and its management.
Now that ABC journalist you were telling me earlier made an interesting slip, if you want to consider that.
Yes, he did. He actually said to Mr. Boykov that it was unlikely. He did accept that Mr. Boykov's protest had actually made a legal precedent today. It had actually showed something. And senior police had agreed that what he was saying was right, that you could protest in this way. The journalist agreed that was so, but he said it's unlikely that my report on this, he had a cameraman too, would come to fruition because his manager, his editor, call him as you will, said that there was likely to be right-wing violence in the park and the police will have to restrain people and so on. That's very newsworthy. Make sure you get all the details and so on. That's the story. Let's do our best to run that. Well, there was no story like that, even though its legal ramifications go far beyond a couple of so-called far-right people or something being arrested, which never happened, as said. So there you have an example of ABC managed news. What they really wanted to see was an incident, police arresting somebody, handcuffs, thrown in the van. That would have been a story, and it would have been along the lines of people who defy lockdowns and public health orders and so on. They didn't get that, so the ABC ain't going to run it.
No, but you and I know that there was a rich story to be had, but it runs counter to the narrative.
Counter to the narrative, that is correct.
The protest that took place on Saturday the 24th, they're building a narrative around that that's similar to the one around the so-called Capitol Hill rioters in the US. Now, they gave a free pass in Victoria to Black Lives Matter protesters. They were a little more stringent about that in Sydney, to be totally fair. But you can see double standards at play all over the place. For instance, Gladys Berejiklian-Maguire, that's an in-joke, by the way, that relates to her corrupt ex-one, Daryl Maguire, who'll be cropping up in Australia First Party and New Australian Bulletin's reports very soon over a particular matter in Wagga Wagga. But she was photographed with her new beau. What is he, a Jewish lawyer?
He's very able senior counsel, that's right. He defended her during her hearings in the Independent Commission Against Corruption. That's apparently how they met.
Isn't that a bit dodgy?
You'd think so. It's a little bit shifty, a little bit incestuous actually, but yes, I think that the narrative she wants to run on the protests from last Saturday is that it's almost a proto-insurgency and the police have to come down really hard.
Yeah, but it's one that doesn't apply to her or her beau, because as I was about to say, they were both photographed. I think it was in somewhere in Sydney CBD, grabbing themselves a coffee, not social distancing.
No mask.
They might have stuck the tongue in at some point into their mouths, I should say. Being very good, but just for listeners, Jim just grimaced with a horrified expression. But of course, we know the real reason she wasn't wearing a mask is she couldn't find one that would fit around that nose of hers. But that's a low joke, isn't it? We're above all that. But now you can see a definite narrative, particularly at play in the media, as they pick it apart. They today, I think it was on the Daily Mail's very interesting because they're firing all bullets at it. And they've pulled out a nurse to say, oh, these people. I think they quoted either Dictator Dan or Gladys as calling them evil. What they're really doing is creating a folk devil out of anybody that would question the veracity of their response to this Chinese lab manufactured virus, which we will also remind readers, and will be spelled out in an upcoming New Australian Bulletin article, a very long piece, was financed by the US, the same US that denied it could have been created in a lab, as the outgoing and outlier President Donald Trump, that was a interesting mistake, Donald Trump had suggested. But so what we see from those protests, one, as they do, is conflating them with the far right, which is why they whipped along today, hoping to buy into that narrative. But Simeon's just a little bit too savvy,
a little bit too slippery. Look, this far right thing, I did say to the journalist, for argument's sake, do you know a certain journalist called Alex Mann? He said yes, and I said, look, sometimes Mr. Mann comes up with some very interesting information. I said, but his conceptualisation is faulty. You see, a lot of the people who demonstrated, for argument's sake, in these so-called freedom things in Melbourne and Sydney, are actually of certain, I'll just say, ethnic derivations. Well, you know, there's people, the man who runs...
It's a friendly Australian...
Well, the man who runs it in Melbourne is an Arab, and I think in Sydney it's heavily Arabised. And the interesting thing, well, we know why that is, but the interesting thing about it is that that doesn't fit readily this far-right narrative that they want to impose on it. Also, too, some of the people who demonstrated in it, there's some very well-meaning people who carry an unusual flag. It's the red ensign, and they have a very, very, they're sovereignty people, and they have a very interesting narrative about where Australia's sovereignty went wrong, and in fact it gives me a headache and trying to unravel it. But to call them far right, they're not that at all. They're people with a very, very elaborate, I would say a little bit crankish interpretation of the Australian Constitution.
What they're also conflating is the conspiracy theory model that they equate to, quote, the QAnon, and so anybody questioning government policy or any move, and a move as extreme as curtailing liberties, particularly when this virus has just failed to live up to the expectations of, say, a Spanish flu, or even the national road toll or the state road toll. I think Victoria was much more hit. I am not suggesting, and New Australian Bulletin and Australia First Party are not suggesting that COVID isn't. We know it's real because they made it in a lab. And we are not advising listeners or readers to not have a vaccine or to have a vaccine. That is not for politicians. That is not for media people to advise. That is for your doctor to advise you. If you've got a good, reliable doctor who's not doing the bidding of Big Pharma.
Well, look, I'll be quite frank here. Many of these things are issues arising from this virus and medications and so on and so forth. That's one debate. The sort of debate that I'm looking at here is the civil liberties aspect of it, and the attempt to set up a new model for, if you like, social control. We've seen remarkable things such as the control of wages, the control of benefits, the control of debt. All of these things that have taken place is actually quite revolutionary in Australian politics. I won't speak about the rest of the so-called European world, but just in Australian politics. And it's so developed in its effect that we now see that the establishment parties are even planning, virtually in the open, to invent new parties to make sure that public protest at the parties that have put us into this coronavirus authoritarian regime don't actually experience loss of credibility, loss of power, that there's no questioning of the regime itself. And we've seen in the last few days talk of this new revitalised Liberal Democratic Party, which is really only the old Liberal Democratic Party with a lot of ex-Liberal politicians leading it, to be libertarian in defence of your rights and stand up against force and whatnot. But where do they direct their preferences? To the Liberal Party. What is their ideology? Well, it's the Liberal side of the Liberal Party. What's their main bugbear? Well, the Liberals have moved away from proper Liberal principles. In other words, it's a satellite party. In today's Australian, we learn that the Family First Party is to be revived in South Australia by a couple of partly religious Labor guys who've left the ALP. They might have left the ALP organisationally, but I doubt they've left the ALP ideologically. The same with Campbell Newman being the Liberal Democratic Senate candidate in Queensland. He certainly left the LNP organisationally, but he's never left it ideologically and really politically. So we can see there's a lot of challenge, and it's not just inside the framework of that sort of party-ish politics. There's a lot of challenge from people who are really questioning where this is going. If I was a very young Australian, say someone just entering the workforce age 21 or 22, what I've been burdened with is a massive public debt, a massive debt that I will carry through my entire working life. The regime has juggled its way out of a lot of the economic problems that other countries have had, but they've only done it by taking on massive debt. So there's a lot of problems that have come up in the system. These things need to be addressed. We would never have thought of the Liberal Party running debt financing. This is something that they abandoned when they abandoned Milton Friedman economics.
This is why they're moving away from the Liberal Party, because the essential core tenets of conservatism have been abandoned. I mean, they were abandoned when they got behind gay marriage, and their whole orientation to the traditional nuclear family was left aside. But you have to see that all of this economic stuff, and you said you won't tie it into the rest of the Europa world, but I would, because it follows a pattern, and particularly emanating from the United States. And what's it called? The Great Reset. The Great Resetters at Davos have changed the name of that, by the way, although it still gets colloquial usage, even by the Rand Corporation. They're calling it the Davos Agenda. And what was the agenda? To smash the established economy that's based on neoliberal economics.
Correct. Look, I was merely referring to the Australian case. I'm not saying...
Oh, yeah. No, we look at the Australian case, but we understand that it's not just a matter of this country's reaction to an emergency that has arisen. Yes. It's something that's coordinated globally and doesn't just serve an Australian purpose.
There was a gentleman who led a small business association in Australia for many years who put to me that the moment would come where that major social prop of the Liberal Party would actually be soaked up, almost expropriated by a new big company corporatism. Now, this is something, as everyone who knows their Liberal Party history knows, that part of its genius, and I take my hat off to crooks like Sir Robert Menzies and all the rest of the Liberal boys, they created a system whereby the small man, the so-called forgotten Australian, the bloke who ran a corner shop or a tradie business or had a small enterprise, was revered and respected, and he was allowed to go out and make his few pennies and march down the street once a year with Gina Rinehart and the oligarchs, and seriously believed that he could become an oligarch too if he only worked a little harder. The Liberals have relied on this, I'll say, class of persons, for aspirant group of people for 3/4 of a century. But now the jig is up. And to make this, if you like, Great Reset work, you have to expropriate the so-called middle class and parts of the lower middle class. They're going to be squeezed out of existence.
Can I just say what Davos itself says about that? We're going to move business away from profit, which is like saying we're going to move fish away from the ocean. I'm plagiarising myself there from my own article, but why not? But that's insidious. What the hell does that mean?
Well, it means that obviously if you have a system that isn't driven by the personal profit motive, one of the mistakes that I suppose a lot of forgotten people make is that they believe that the owners of massive capital, huge capital, but not just banking capital, but industrial and other forms of capital, that to them profit isn't the only question involved. And the other point is a small man might look for a 30% return on his labour or something. A mega capitalist only has to rely on a 1% return, and that gives him $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion. This is something that the sort of huge scale enterprise and banking capital, mining capital and so on, the rate of profit can fall, but it's the volume of profit that's actually important.
Well, the profit they're looking at is, and the model is a new one, and it doesn't, this isn't the exact name, but it's the theory behind it, social economy. This is what the big corporations are pushing them, and one of them, which just happens to own the company Pfizer, which, as we know, produces the vaccine, is BlackRock. Now, BlackRock has a number of these social warrior CEOs, Larry Fink, and the other one, his name I think is Brian Deese. It might be Brian Deese. And he's linked to the Biden administration in all sorts of ways. He was a campaign manager for Hillary Clinton, and his position in BlackRock is to oversee, and don't forget BlackRock owns assets in fossil fuels, so it's got a duality going, but is to oversee the new environment-linked economy, green, and all of that. So you can see a real strange pattern occurs when you join the dots on all of these. But what they're talking about with, you know, the business won't have a profit, it'll have a social value. I mean, they are speaking in catchphrases. Yes, there is no explanation.
You can't separate the ownership of capital necessarily from its enjoyment, unless you go down the road of saying that there are managers and other technicians who also profit from it. And that, of course, is quite true. There's no doubt about that. The benefits of this, some people have actually re-coined the old phrase that it's a type of new feudalism. My old friend, if I can call him that, Eric Butler, the old conservative who ran the League of Rights, actually, one of his better works, he actually talked about the masters of money trying to create a veritable new feudalism. So we all become serfs, whether we own our own house or we don't, whether we only live by our labour or whether or not we might own a couple of shares. Maybe some of the forgotten people might still maintain a few shares or something like that. But basically, we all end up in a total obeisance to those who possess the large wealth. Now, this is an evil system. This is, if you like, an extension of the capitalist revolution to a type of dictatorship that's even open. In fact, it's actually quite ironic that if you go back in time, the leftists always used to claim that fascism was the terrorist dictatorship of monopoly and financial capital. well, it's just a question of what you're really calling fascism for the sake of the argument.
Well, in their use of the word, they really are.
They are the fascists, and what they're actually will create is a huge economy that is run by their corporations. People will be serfs. There'd be a terroristic network of paramilitarised police and other agencies. There will be restrictions on people's wealth gathering, their movement. It's a cross between Dickensian capitalism, one of Joe Stalin's factories there for a while, and something that is coming out of a womb of destruction. It's sometimes said, it used to be an old Marxist argument, that capitalism would also from time to time destroy the very means of production itself. In other words, not the products of production, but the very means of production, in order to redevelop them on a higher level. Now that argument is a very challenging one, and a lot of modern lefties don't even look at it. But you actually look now at what's occurring. We see old models of behaviour being destroyed, new models of behaviour being created.
And you'll note that in Davos, you don't hear any reference to the words democracy or democratic.
Of course not.
And, bearing in mind that
the new words are sustainable, equitable, reasonable, futuristic, and so forth. There's no attempt to suggest that the organs that you might vote for every few years really have any power at all.
Oh, mate, suffrage is one of those things that have been
lost a long time ago. In fact, there's a saying that Slack Bastard might like, and which he used to know, but he's now forgotten because he's a lockdown merchant, is that if voting could change anything, they'd make it illegal. Used to be an old anarchist slogan. Used to see it everywhere, and it's actually quite true.
The whole point of the capitalism, which was once synonymous with democracy, with that word, was to allow the illusion. It was freedom through consumerism. It was a type of freedom. I knew this cat would claw his way in here, but for listeners, sorry, the terror, the head of the cat Starpo has just come in. Yes, and he's completely thrown us for a six here. You can probably hear him meowing. Yep, there he goes. So it always was an illusion, but it was a comfortable illusion.
Indeed. In fact, the idea was that you could consume, you could buy goods, you could achieve your little version of suburban success. But unfortunately, that's no longer really possible.
No, that's completely. It was modelled on the self, right?
Yeah,
and
that's right.
The self in the beginning of that post World War II revolution, where they were selling capitalism and democracy as the same thing. The marketing was to the general, right? You need this, you need that. Things changed a bit when the social revolutions of the 1960s came along, and the emphasis became on the self. They realised that there was a generation that didn't subscribe to those general values that challenged them. So they restructured capitalism accordingly, and the focus became on the self. Well, we've exited that now. I'd say 2001, when the Twin Towers went down, was the very first stage of the Great Reset. That was the recalibration of freedom, per se. And you'll note both the war on terror, trademark symbol included, and the COVID-19, the phenomenon, are comparable.
Well, they always argue that they're for freedom, and we could argue too that if you go back in time, the great revolution of the 1960s was that the ruling system accommodated leftist protest. A lot of the values of leftism, the old idea of the class war and revolutionary socialism, went out the door. And sexual politics, emotional politics, identity politics, became the main thing that the left sold. This was something that could be actually absorbed into a globalising model. Why not? So what if you have gender bending? So what if you have multiracialism? So what if you have so-called indigenous rights? It really doesn't matter, because it's just another step along the road to a global world. And a lot of the leftists bought that, and the leftists walked away from the idea of a so-called revolutionary overturn of capitalism. But contrary to the conservative argument that we hear over and over again from all these anti-cultural Marxist people and so forth, the bottom line is that the system itself can accommodate any form of internationalism whatsoever, and the leftists were internationalists. The globalists are the ultimate internationalists. These people were taken on board as propagandists and managers, and they've served very well. But then, as you pointed out, we've now reached the stage where the system itself is going to be rejigged or reset again. So for us,
according to the Rand Corporation, it's underway.
Right, it's underway. So a lot of these leftists now don't really serve any particular purpose either. In fact, globalism has achieved all of their goals. You want to be, say, a feminist who thinks she's a man, you can.
But look at the cost of that, right? Now, a feminist, for the feminist, because women, as much as there's an attack on masculinity and they wish to cancel that, so women are being cancelled. Mate, the rights of a man who identifies as a woman has more cachet than an actual woman's rights.
That's correct.
This whole identitarian concept...
And that's where they've now reached this third stage. This third revolution is to smash everything around you that you even think is real. And if you can dissolve concepts of identity or purpose or sexuality or age or speciesism, if you can dissolve everything into the slush, the idea of a society of serfs now becomes eminently possible.
Oh, we are a society.
And this great evil, if we go back to the original point, if we look at the coronavirus crisis, there is a saying of never allowing a good crisis to go by. And this one is one that is given to the state the ability to regulate and control not only parts of the economy, but to destroy other parts of the economy. If the aim is to, say, expropriate the forgotten man, there's now an opportunity to actually do it. And
well, they make him complicit in his own subjugation, and
that would be right.
A point I was making earlier, read the protests and the media, is the creation of a new folk devil, evil. They're calling those protesters evil. They've set about a task force to track down and identify those that were involved. As I said, it's very comparable to what the fascist, or use it in the leftist sense.
Well, there's a saying that the causes might be the same, but the Gestapo changed sides. And we now have the situation where secret policing in Australia is playing a major role in this.
Which begs the question, given that we know that the authority, like for instance, we know the base was a FBI construct.
Yes.
We know, and Matt Heinbach of the, what was he, the National Workers Party or something like that. Yeah, big Nazi boy over there in America. He recanted his views when they were coming after him for the events of the Unite the Right rally in 2017. That's the cat. And now he's swung back. He's come back firmer than ever. He's denouncing everyone. He's hardcore. We need it up. You tell me that that's not. He hasn't been with the FBI boys.
So what you're saying, they're actually now even creating aspects of a new opposition and putting it out there. Well, the far-right devilry in Australia is part of that.
And as we spoke about the conflation of the, they call it the COVID deniers, they call them COVIDiots, super spreaders. They've got all the nomenclature, but they refer to these online groups that it was organised. Now, I really don't think the amount of people, the numbers of which they are being very rubbery with. Yes, they're trying to deflate the numbers that were there, but there's no way all those people would just beholden to some conspiracy group. No. But I believe, given that we know the state's involvement with far-right groups over here, we know that they've got a finger somewhere in that group of boys in Melbourne, etc. Well, what's to say they're not behind COVID denying groups just to accelerate a
well, that
folk
would be
devil?
very likely, and we look at the behaviour of black flag operations of every sort, you would get that. There is no linkage between most of these demonstrations and the far right. In fact, this far right neurosis with these type of coronavirus things goes back through the pages of the August Guardian, I think, to late last year, where they were predicting it. They were quoting ASIO saying that it existed, that there were definite evidence that there were people involved in stoking this. And again, all you have is the word of the head of the secret police that it is true.
Well, let's look at the word of the Guardian. Who are the people behind the Guardian?
Left
You got
liberals.
Rob Sparrow's brother, Jeff Sparrow, an anarcho-communist.
Yes.
You got that Jason Wilson. These people are as red, and they are as
System Marxists. They're system Marxists.
Yeah.
They're bought and paid. And unfortunately, there are people who really go and look for it. There's some recent journalism by Alex Mann. As I said, sometimes...
No, he's a nitwit.
Well, Mann, he digs
You've
around.
spoken to him, I know, but he's a nitwit.
He digs around and, he does his best to dredge up some facts. But the trouble is with this sort of journalists is they cannot get free of the prison in which they are.
Yeah, I mean, the editor, whoever they or whatever their job description is, would not allow that.
Would not allow. So once again, we're looking for coronavirus criminals, as you said, who are organising.
Yes, it's a new folk devil.
It's a
evil,
witchcraft,
quote,
and they're evil.
Evil.
Evil
Here
people.
are two premiers who are, for all intents and purposes, see, this is the dynamic that's been blurred. They are the servants of the people. They are paid by the people.
Yes.
And they continue paying themselves while they deny a living to the people they're putting under lockdown. Just
That's
mind
right.
you. And here they are acting like paternally, like mum. I wrote something like Gladys's heart is broken at the protests. It's fuck Gladys. She doesn't have a heart.
No, Gladys doesn't, and nor does Chairman Dan. In fact, the game that's being played, people like that playing opposite ends, they say, of the ideological spectrum. They're not opposite ends of it. They are the spectrum. They're the same. I mean, we can make up jokes about them in different ways of how they behave, but they represent the same ideology in politics.
This is why these satellites, liberal satellites, have been created, because everybody knows that the Liberal Party has just drifted to that global centre where the left has dictated. They keep calling themselves a victim. It's essential to their to their zeitgeist. Yet they have commanded all these changes. They've got everything they wanted, and as such, that's what you see with these conservatives, like the Republicans in America. They move closer and closer. They say, "Oh, all right, well, we'll embrace gay, this, that, and sooner or later, every position, it's going to become where just the typical moderate conservative position is now the far right, according to their own topography.
And well, that's part of the game that's played, shifting goalposts, and it happens continually. People can't get a grip on what politics really is, because it just moves. Like, as we were saying, the Liberal Democrats are back, the Family First are back. Mrs. Hanson is finished. One Nation, that was a Liberal satellite for a very long time. Pauline will lose her seat to Campbell Newman next year in the Senate election.
She'll get a pension.
She gets a pension for life. She'll do very, very well. But the point is, the harsh truth for her as a human being is, once you become a satellite force, you get kicked like the dog, and she will be kicked by the people who previously endorsed her.
There's always dancing with the stars.
Well, she can go back to it, but unfortunately, a lot of people are always taken in. We saw Corey Bernardi a few years ago, this great hope, this man who was going to step outside of politics. I mean, the truth should have been known when he was seen down at Sydney's Circular Quay, having a latte with all the big Liberal Party heavyweights at the same time that he's setting up his new party. He was never out of the Liberal Party. Perhaps organisationally he was out of the Liberal Party, but ideologically and politically he was still with it.
Are they really a sort of struggle within the party itself against the right and the moderate?
Occasionally you get, I'll say truthfully minded.
Is that what it's all about?
Sometimes you get truthfully minded people in any organisation. It wouldn't matter what it was. So there's always a cracking of the whip inside these machines to make them serve. And who knows, even Bernardi himself might have said some comment once or twice that made sense. But that's not the point of it. The overall point of it is that the politics is driven in the same direction, towards globalism, towards the oppression of the ordinary Australian worker and middle class person. That's what it's designed to do. It's to entrench the rule of the oligarchs and make it permanent.
Now, you were talking about serfdom and a new class model, I think you were getting at. Now, curiously, we just talked about the redundancy of the age of the self, but the age of identity is here, and it's a conformist concept based on demography. Race is essential to it. I mean, we cannot skirt around the taboo of race any longer, because it is pivotal to it. Critical race theory, all of this crap,
Remember,
has its place in creating a new class system based upon race.
And they do, and by denying something they recreated in a new way, essentially they're arguing that no races exist.
Well, that argument's gone. I mean, they can't even try to straight-facedly...
No, they're not telling you that anymore. But they're certainly telling you, if you get to the bottom line of it, that one group of people on this continent will be cleansed and replaced with others.
Oh, the magicals, the magical black races.
Wherever they're from or whatever they are. But the dominant group economically believe that they will remain that way by broadening their base, by bringing in new happy people who become part of that ruling class. So we're seeing the transcendent of the idea of a trader class or a national class to some international one.
Yes, subordinate to that.
And it was mooted a few years ago. Some economists talked about a transnational class of capitals. You can call them that if you want. You can call them anything. But if you simply call them a class of globalists that is national, which is international, organised everywhere, anyone can be in it if you've reached into its ranks. You don't necessarily even have to be an owner of capital, but someone who manages it, controls it, and applies it. So we're seeing a whole new evolution in politics. And for Australia and Australians, it's a disaster, because obviously a certain group of people are going to be on the receiving end in Australia.
See, that is the disgusting thing about it, right? All of this stuff was discussed with Hillary and Bill Clinton's people over Davos over the last 20, 30 years, etc. And in their Great Reset video and the subsequent video, which New Australian Bulletin will be linking to, they one of the platforms is that the concept of sovereign nationhood is gone, and you've got to ask yourself, as a citizen of a country, wait on, I didn't vote for my country.
No. Look, I think the writers at New Australian Bulletin are really doing a great job of research into these things, and I commend the writers there for this. The fact is that we need to look very, very closely at the fact that there is a complete divorce between political right and political sovereignty, and those who actually control those things. This is an old argument that's been around for a very, very long time, but it has an enormous ramification. In fact, it's an elephant in the room that a lot of people find very, very hard to address. In my long life, I've unfortunately met people who found it so hard they virtually cracked up under the strain of it. And it essentially comes down to this. Insofar as it was ever possible, and I would probably say it never was, what is coming into being now cannot be removed by the free vote of a democratic people, for one very simple reason: it won't go. Now, this was probably always the case in many ways. It's the theories of the left and the right have said it, communists have said it, fascists have said it, all sorts of people used to say it long ago. But now it's actually become something that's transfixed right in front of us. It's very, very real.
Well, you vote for what the system
tells
offers you. It gives you the choices under the Westminster system. Right. You get two choices.
You get two choices, which are the same choice. In fact, our good friend Professor Rob from the Slack Bastard crew there, he always quotes Noam Chomsky, and I quoted Noam Chomsky at some election meetings a few years ago. He said that the mark of an unfree society is where you are permitted to argue more and more about less and less. And essentially that's what we now have in our country, every European country and many other countries for good measure, that you can argue about anything, but you can't argue about the things that glue this new construct together. If you do, you are evil, you're crazy, you're a conspiratologist, you're mentally ill, or something along these lines, because why would anyone oppose this beautiful new resetting of human life?
Where you'll own nothing, you'll eat
you
bugs,
will be happy.
you'll
be happy.
You'll worship the sun.
That's right, but
not
you'll be
like
happy. You can have a new identity every day. You can simply change your shirt.
You'll be happy because Pfizer will dish up some drug that
they'll give you a drug that will make you happy. And the bottom line with this is that you cannot remove this sort of a political system by some free decision. And once that's set, once that's brought out into the open, well, that's something that the emerging thought police come actual political police.
Change the system. You can't even go for a walk at Rod Point.
Without them attacking you, more or less. But the fact is that once it's seen that there is a nexus between thought policing and political policing, and there always has been, it's the 1984 society, and people would then say, well, if I can't oppose it one way, I have to find other ways to oppose
that's the thing. We can draw as a reference tool from 1984, and we have so many matching criteria: the rewriting of history, the creation of newspeak, the destruction of the language, etc. But the point is how you perceive that. Do you sit there and say, oh, this is happening as a matter of happenstance, or no, this is happening because it's happening and I have to do something about it, but what do I do? You know?
What do I do? Unfortunately for all systems...
Do you understand what I mean about those perceptions?
I'm right with
because
you there,
some are sort of not really articulating the fact. They're sort of dumbfoundedly relaying the ticker tape of information going past without,
drawing the conclusion from the information. But one thing I think is likely to become much more prevalent is that those Australians who have questioned any part of this, and for whatever reason, will progressively come to the conclusion that they're fighting a machine. It's not mistaken. It's not something that you petition a grievance to and it will understand that it's doing wrong to you and change its mind. No, it seeks to do this because it wants to. That your system, I'll call it a regime if you want, it wants to make these changes because it's going to make them, because it's profitable, it's right, it makes sense. We can get results, we can globalise better, we can put in a new system of profit making, will last for 1,000 years. The global Reich of finance capital, they think, will last 1,000 years. And anyone who objects to
Bitcoin seems to be undermining that.
Yeah, maybe, but
so they co-opt that.
But I'll co-opt everything. But we're looking at a situation where people will probably seem to be in larger numbers questioning this. Now, it's an odd thing to have a regime questioned over a virus, but then when you think about it, it's not. You can question a system over just about anything. And if it leads to questions being asked that the system doesn't wish to answer, and that's something I think that we're seeing.
They demonise the question.
And the questioning, the person, the question itself. If you ask the question, it's a subversive act. But I'll make my remarks. There was an incident today at that park that refreshed me when a police car pulled up, and I'll tailor the words here very carefully so as to not identify the officer. And he said, what's going on here? There's so many police cars in the area. And
he didn't even know.
He said, some protest, and it must be you. And he was speaking to Mr. Boykov, and I heard the conversation. And he said something like this. He said, look, as far as I'm concerned, he said, I don't see why people can't have a protest. Yes, maybe observe a few rules given this virus is about, but it's really all about freedom of speech, and good luck to you, mate, go for it. And he drove away. Now, that's a view that other officers articulated last year when a sneaky cop...
And this, during that protest.
Yeah, that's right, a number did. And there was a sneaky cop got access to an internal police email system and sent out thousands of letters last October saying, what are you asking us to do here? You're asking us to police the population in a way that might be unlawful, unconstitutional, unreasonable. We're suspicious of wanting to do it. This sort of questioning inside a system, in the old days of revolutions 100 years ago, the lefties used to say that there was that beautiful moment that would come where the policeman would no longer raise his baton or the soldier his rifle. And at that moment, the forces of authority would often merge themselves into the people, and you had revolution. Well, in a case of Australia today, there may be thousands of people who are employed inside the bureaucracies, the health bureaucracy, police, judicial, wherever they are, who will see things come in front of them that are simply not right. And
but what will they do about it?
What will they do about it? Well, we saw a dissenting voice, we've seen dissenting voices, but as this group of police said in their email last year, and it was a group of police, that obeying an illegal order, illegal either by law or illegal by convention and so on of the people, is no defence. We know that the Nuremberg thing, the German officers said we were just obeying orders, which they were. That was not accepted as a defence, and they were hanged for the presumption. Well, the liberal democratic world takes that as a great moment in history, but it doesn't seem to draw the lesson, which is that if orders are criminal and illegal and you obey them, you become part of the problem. A lot of people will not obey these orders.
Well, that is a sign of an authoritarian government.
Well, it is, and a lot of people, they will not obey these orders. So you may find that there will be thousands of people making decisions who will not be obeying orders.
Let me ask you something. Are you going to get the vaccine?
No.
Can you tell me why not?
Well, look, yes, I can. There's a number of experts who say that vaccines that depend on altering genetic responses inside cells and so forth, it opens up questions. These things are not finalised. I will say this, I'll answer with a different anecdote, that they say that some people who have HIV were cured by antiviral drugs, actual just like, antiviral drugs, finished, not vaccines. There's no vaccine for HIV, but there are various drugs that it's now argued have actually cured sufferers, finished. The virus is no longer in their body. There are a number of promising drugs that suggest that coronavirus can be addressed in the same way. No drug's ever good for you, but at the same time, I've had some terrible headaches and I've taken an aspirin, and some people say that aspirin ain't good for you. But there's a time and place for everything. So I would be very sceptical about taking a vaccine. And I also make the obvious point that to divide your population into those who are vaccinated and those who are not, and setting out a regime of rights for one and no rights for another, that's quite interesting logic. And I don't think a lot of these so-called liberals have actually worked this one out, that it's not to do with the disease, it's to do with segregating into the population into two categories, those who are privileged and those who are not privileged. Now, if we take the health question out of it, we've actually got a very serious political question there.
Yeah, because look, we take for granted vaccinations against whooping cough, measles, etc. Do we now have to categorise legitimate diseases from the man-made variety of bat flu, courtesy of the American government and the Chinese? And all of this, while we're talking about authoritarian regimes, and by the way, I just want to go off on a sidebar here. I was reading some interesting stuff from the Rand Corporation about the defunding of the police, and how something that appears to be a large social movement is actually a premeditated economic move to change the model of policing.
That's right.
And it could also have been to remove a potentially resistant civic force against them. But that's...
Well, actually, you end up with a situation where crimes become civil actions. And you'd know from ancient law codes that the justice that people would seek would be financial reparation, not an independent system of courts.
It was all
jails.
based on money. But what does that mean now? You say that, and yet do you realise in San Francisco, etc., big companies, chain stores like Target, etc., are having to shut early and shut entire branches because there's a law that because of alterations to the law, which means they're not going to arrest anybody that steals goods valued under $1,000. So these knobs are just walking in, grabbing. It's a matter of choice. If you pay, what sort of sales clerk is going to risk getting shot in the face? For that? So it's both. You say crime is now. What did you say?
It'll be a matter of civil litigation.
A civil litigation, but crime is a matter of
with private enforcement agencies. So if you destroy the law, now we know law has other issues.
If it was all based on property, that whole notion of property.
Well, see, here's one for would-be Marxists out there. If we accepted for a moment, and it has an element of truth in it, that all law is the province of a ruling class that wields it like a machine over the other. If we take that as the argument, we've now reached a fascinating stage for which Marxists have no answer. What if the ruling class shattered the whole concept of law itself? And there was no law, there was no law code, there is no standard of morality supposedly on which law is based. Law becomes an arbitrary thing, whereby whatever they say and whatever they want, so the law shall be.
You end up with that, what is it, Meher Baba's utterance, nothing is true, everything is permitted.
That would be correct. And there's an interesting thing from poor old Karl Marx too. He said that all history is the history of class struggle. He said that leads to the victory of a class. And there's a fascinating phrase, or the common ruin of the contending classes. No Marxist has ever discussed what the common ruin of the contending classes ever was, simply because Marxists are progressivists, therefore they never thought of it. But it has another application, that the globalist class that now governs us can actually shatter all previously existing classes, because all these classes had some social articulation. They were based on something, they were based on histories. They came out of somewhere. They came out of the histories of European civilization over the last 2,000 years. You can break these things up now by creating a new cog in a wheel. Even our mate Noam Chomsky says that, where everyone simply becomes a factor of production. Everyone can be replaced by someone else. Everyone could be replaced by the lowest paid worker from the Deccan in India. It really doesn't matter. What was previously class arrangements can be dissolved. Whatever was the history of corporate institutions, guilds, professional associations, these things can all be dissolved.
Well, mate,
we end up with nothing.
A human being's labour value doesn't exist anymore because, automated pick and pack machines that build houses, etc. But the question, with all this authoritarianism, we've marked out China as our enemy, and it is traditionally undesirable and incompatible with the Australian psyche and Australia historically. But what's their beef? Because, you know what I mean, we don't like...
Their beef is...
It's got nothing to do with democracy. We don't have democracy.
Their beef is that some countries and some peoples are somewhat outside of the control of the system. And
that is both economically
and politically.
But it's certainly not ideologically.
No, they follow similar things. But there are other players in the game who have particular objectives or are more traditional than they are. The ruling group in the European type world and their Klingon allies, who stick to them like glue amongst other peoples, they have no identity anymore, really. They're not Germans, they're not anything, they're not Swiss, they're not Argentinians, they have no country. The ruling class has no country. Brother Marx there was quite wrong. It's not the workers who have no country, it's the ruling people who have no country. They don't want one. They seek to organise the economy on a global basis. Any identity that gets in the way of that, they don't want it, and any identity that serves them on a daily purpose, they'll freely adopt. So it's a revolution in psychological terms, economic terms. It's an absolute revolution.
Well, you're a victim of this revolution, and I'll call you a victim. You've had your bank account cancelled, or your right to
operate accounts for Australia First.
You're
that's right.
One of many different
are
people
others.
in Australia. There's others.
There are others.
You're, I think, cancelled in the sense of your legal right to protection. The police are certainly not interested in following up.
The man who attacked me. No, I'd say probably not.
Nor am I, by the way. I just haven't had my bank account.
They look at last week. They're saying they're going to use photographic recognition technology to identify people who demonstrated in this protest. I know for a fact that the person who came here, who on my case, thank the gods, I disarmed, who could have otherwise killed me with a hammer. Photographs exist of this person and his partner. I've got no doubt this person can be identified, but he has not been identified.
Well, we know where they are anyway.
Well, there's a good idea of where they are, and the fact is that if police resources can be spent so massively to arrest people for a coronavirus thing, it makes you wonder, putting my case aside, what if someone had tried to kill the daughter of Kerry Packer or something, and they're too busy because they're investigating coronavirus outrages. It shows a perverse logic of how the system will work.
Talking about bringing the army in, and not to hand out COVID packs, but to manage the populace, i.e. create checkpoints.
Well,
and I mean, what the
that's
hell?
Northern Ireland
Fucking Northern
psychosis.
Ireland, yeah.
But you run a terrible risk, or rather we don't, they do. As many of the young soldiers who have joined the armed forces for valid reasons may look at this as something that they're not really not only trained
we
to do,
hope to be. They've tried to brainwash. I mean, the military is something, particularly in America, where they're trying to feminise the armed forces. Essentially, it used to be conservatives that would flock to the army. It was a property. It was a cultural property of the conservative right, the Republicans, if you will. And they want to get rid of anyone like that out of the army. We haven't seen that here. See, what I want to stress to everybody is this doesn't have to happen here. Australia's not the same as America.
There's a great line from some French story I saw where a young officer arrested a general, and he said, in my day, lieutenants did not arrest generals. And the young man replied, but in my time, generals do not liquidate countries. And it's an interesting thing that the foreign educated and foreign modelled military leadership in Australia may well wish to obey those sort of orders, but a lot of the young people, I have grievous doubts that they've trained them, I'll say, properly. The orders they're going to be asked to enforce are things that they see as the reason that they joined the army in the first place to oppose.
But theirs is to obey.
It is, but there's an interesting thing, as said previously, there is a problem inside all systems that I don't want to sound like a humanist philosopher, but I don't believe that Australians or any other people on earth from the middle of Africa to the east of Asia are necessarily people who wish to do wrong. And if soldiers are ordered to murder or to treat people in a certain method, they have to have a good reason why they're doing this. Now, our army's never been trained necessarily other than the usual platitudes of democracy and freedom. And as you rightly mentioned before, democracy is now going out of the narrative. When you ask young soldiers to operate civil defence type operations, but against their own people, who could even be their mother or their sister or their cousin, it raises serious questions about what they're being ordered to do. And unfortunately, that's something that has to grow in our country at every level. Teachers have to object to being what they're taught. Workers have to object to changes in work rules. Soldiers have to object. Police have to object.
Well, we won't look to the Liberal Party to solve that. I mean,
or one of their satellites.
May be saying some things we'd like to hear in regards to returning the military to what its purpose is. But safe schools, they've got a new name for it, and under the Liberal government, it's back in a
it's all that stuff,
Liberal, which is what I mean about. I mean, Morrison is.
It means that these protests have shown one very interesting thing, that there's a growing alliance across the board of very disparate forces, very different people, in fact, with even different agendas, but they all have one interesting thing at the baseline, is that they're very suspicious that the coronavirus crisis is being used in some way to deprive them of their liberty to work, their freedom to associate, and also even more diabolical, their right to think. And from that point of view, they say no. And if we call them rejectionists, which is a great term, I love it myself, if we call them rejectionists, you don't need...
I like that term. I think, well, I'll use that.
you don't need a majority of people to reject. In some historical struggles, I won't name them, but in some historical struggles throughout the world, you only need 25 or 30% of people to say no, and in the end, the answer may become no if you're determined to actually fight. I've seen, we said before about vaccines, but I was driving somewhere today, and the number of people lining up very dutifully to get a vaccine was absolutely remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. You know,
look,
no problem.
Look, I'm going to start winding this thing up.
Thank you.
As to that vaccine, I just want to say I'm not going to get it either. I don't trust something that has been whipped up by Pfizer or AstraZeneca, two companies who are prodigious at the table of Davos, who are linked to the Biden government and therefore the Great Reset. Funny how they're handing out a drug for free. What about all these other...
like the cancer drugs for a lot of our suffering old people.
They're not handing those out for free, but they're handing this mark of the beast. And if you want to get alarmist, if you want a good conspiracy, just bear in mind you won't be able to buy or sell unless you're on the computer and have the mark.
All the Christians should rise now, but unfortunately they're not.
They're and so I don't believe there's any provable efficacy in it. I think if one person's died of blood clot and more than one have, I'm not prepared to play roulette with a drug, but they're going to hold the gun to my head and say, well, you won't be able to earn. Well, I can't earn anyway, thank you, because I'm a foul of the system. And that's another thing, putting all these people out of work, and yet who is the one group, the massive chunk of unemployed? They're not being offered any money this time around in New South Wales. You know, they can't even get out to look for a fucking job.
Well, that would be true too.
It's absolutely,
we can count on the fact that I think over the next several months there'll be more destabilising inside Australian politics, and I'm not talking about electoral politics or the big parties, but more destabilising inside. And ironically, as we actually see, some groups that even maybe have had some tendentious relevancy, like the far left, are now people in favour of the vaccine regime.
That's an amazing thing when I was looking through those paid.
But as we were saying at the start of this discussion, a disease can be just as effective in altering the politics of a system than a war. I think our mate, the hero of the left, Trotsky, used to say that war is the locomotive of history. Well, here's a funny one where you may have a disease being a locomotive of history. It changes politics. This is so important. I think we need to have a very close look on every political group as to what reaction it takes towards the growing authoritarianism. And if they come up on the wrong side of it, then you don't deal with them.
Thanks very much for talking to us tonight. We're going to do this again. We're going to try to make this a monthly gig, you know. And a message I want to leave to the listeners is that don't just point your finger at the news. Don't just point your finger at all these bad things and just, you know, fall into a sort of end of world panic. Do something. People can do something. This is Nathan Sykes with Jim Saleam on NabWave Radio for New Australian Bulletin. Check us out at www.com, www.newaustralianbulletin.com. See you later. NabWave Radio, Nationalist Radio from New Australian Bulletin.